Detective Agatha Marple, Glamour, Greed, and the Plane Crash. A detective tale. On the southern edge of the village, where the golden fields met a narrow lane lined with wildflowers, the local airfield hummed quietly with activity. The airfield was hardly more than a modest stretch of grass, marked by faded wooden posts, but it was enough to attract the occasional wanderer, or the curious, as Agatha Marple would have put it. It was early afternoon when Agatha, dressed in her usual tweed jacket and sensible brogues, arrived at the airfield for what she intended to be a pleasant, uneventful outing. The sun sat high in a cloudless sky, and a gentle breeze stirred the tall grass along the fence. She had brought a small notebook, intending to sketch the old barn near the far end of the field, but her attention was soon drawn elsewhere. A cluster of villagers had gathered near the hangar, their heads turned skyward. Agatha followed their gaze. A small biplane was circling above, its silver wings gleaming in the sunlight. With a graceful swoop, it descended toward the runway. As it touched down, its wheels bounced slightly before settling, and the engine let out a contented growl before sputtering to silence. The pilot, Larry Stokes, climbed down from the cockpit with a certain practised flair, doffing his cap to the small crowd that had come to watch. Stokes was a name that stirred whispers, charming and reckless, with a trail of adventures that seemed to follow him like a wisp of smoke. Agatha noted the way he smiled easily, the way he seemed to belong to the sky more than the earth beneath his boots. Among the onlookers was a woman whose presence did not seem incidental. Rose Whitlock, widow of the late Henry Whitlock, stood a little apart from the others, though her gaze never wavered from Stokes. She was well dressed in a summer frock of soft cream fabric, her dark hair gathered beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her face from the sun but not from scrutiny. Agatha's sharp eyes took in the subtle tension in Rose's posture, the way she clutched her handbag a touch too tightly. If the lady was here for a casual afternoon at the airfield, she was doing a poor job of appearing at ease. Stokes walked toward the group, his boots crunching against the gravel path. He exchanged a few pleasantries with the men gathered there, his voice warm and jovial, but his eyes slid quickly over the crowd as if looking for something, or someone. When he saw Rose, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though he made no move to approach her. Instead, he turned his attention to Albert Wingfield, the portly, affable man who managed the airfield. Wingfield gestured broadly as they talked, pointing toward the far side of the field where another plane was being prepped. Agatha couldn't hear what was said, but her cousin's expression carried an unusual blend of excitement and unease. Something was off, though perhaps only slightly. The air was filled with the pleasant hum of distant engines, the faint chatter of villagers, the occasional chirp of a skylark. Yet beneath it all, Agatha sensed an undercurrent, a faint but distinct tension that hung in the air like the last echo of a note. She wasn't one to rush to conclusions, but her observational instinct stirred. People didn't gather like this for nothing, and smiles like Stokes's rarely came without a touch of calculation. Agatha stayed quiet and watched, her pencil poised above her notebook, waiting for the next detail to emerge. The biplane's engine chugged faintly as it sat on the grass, silver wings flashing in the sunlight. The village airfield's usual air of lazy tranquillity had shifted into something more taut. Agatha Marple, standing slightly apart from the handful of onlookers, adjusted her hat against the glare and studied the scene with her characteristic quiet attentiveness. A stout man in a well-worn tweed coat emerged from a nearby shed, his pace brisk and his face set in an expression that hovered between irritation and concern. He carried a metallic briefcase gripped tightly in one hand as though it contained something of tremendous value or terrible consequence. Agatha tilted her head, her sharp grey eyes narrowing as the man approached the waiting aircraft. He reached Larry Stokes, the aviator, who was leaning nonchalantly against the fuselage, and thrust the case toward him. Their words were exchanged too softly for Agatha to hear, but the language of body and gesture was unmistakable. Larry's easy-going charm seemed to falter, replaced by a brief scowl. The stout man gestured emphatically at the briefcase, his face reddening with what looked like frustration or fear. Larry eventually relented, snatching the case and stowing it in the plane's cargo hold. The exchange was curt, and as the man turned away, he glanced around nervously, as if checking whether anyone had seen more than they ought to. Agatha stood very still, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her parasol, and made no move to acknowledge his furtive look. Meanwhile, Albert Wingfield had strolled over to where Larry was preparing for takeoff. Albert, the genial owner of the airfield, was always eager to chat and laugh with visitors, yet today there was a peculiar stiffness to his manner. As the two men exchanged pleasantries, Albert's tone grew hushed, and his jovial smile faltered when Larry gestured toward the plane and the recently loaded case. The moment was brief, just a flicker of unease on Albert's normally ruddy face, but it didn't escape Agatha's notice. Her cousin was not a man easily rattled, yet something in that briefcase, or perhaps the man who had delivered it, had cast a shadow over his usual affability. The refueling was completed in short order, the plane's engine coughing into life once more. Larry climbed back into the cockpit with the same showman's ease that had earned him admiration in countless airshows. The little crowd at the airfield began to thin, villagers murmuring amongst themselves and drifting toward home or the pub, but Agatha lingered. As Larry made a final check of his instruments, he glanced over at the figures still on the field. His gaze met Rose Whitlock's briefly, but not without significance. Rose, whose composure had seemed so carefully maintained, turned her face slightly and lowered her gaze, gripping her handbag tightly. The moment passed as quickly as it came, but Agatha, who had been pretending to fuss with a fold of her skirt, had caught every nuance. The plane took off smoothly, wheels lifting from the grass and banking sharply as it disappeared into the sky. The field fell quiet again, and the sunlight glinted off the empty patch where the plane had been. Agatha adjusted her gloves and began a slow walk back toward the gate, her mind ticking over each detail. There was nothing immediately out of the ordinary, not a single word spoken in her hearing that might be called suspicious, yet something was there, buried beneath the surface, a subtle crack in the airfield's familiar routine. She had no facts to speak of yet, only a nagging sense that what she had witnessed would not rest quietly. Agatha Marple had always taken her tea at her cousin Albert's house on Wednesdays, a tradition dating back to the days before the war. She preferred his little sitting room to the more ostentatious drawing rooms of her wealthier acquaintances. Here, among the mismatched furniture and faint scent of pipe smoke, she could read quietly or sketch by the light of the small window. Albert's cheerful chatter, though occasionally tiresome, was a comfort too, and he always kept a proper tea service, no chipped china or lukewarm water. On this particular evening, as the shadows lengthened across the small garden, visible through the lace curtains, Agatha was stirring a teaspoon of honey into her cup when a sharp rap sounded at the door. Albert, halfway through a story about the airfield's plans for expansion, looked up in mild annoyance. "Who on earth could that be?" he muttered, placing his pipe down on the side table. Rising slowly from his chair, he went to answer. Agatha, curious, listened to the muffled exchange that followed. A man's voice, strained, urgent, reached her ears, and a moment later Albert re-entered the room with his ruddy complexion looking several shades lighter. "There's been a crash," he said, his voice hollow. "Larry Stokes, his plane went down just beyond the fields." Agatha set her cup down carefully. "Is he—" "Alive," Albert said quickly. "Shaken but alive. They've sent for help. We'd better go." The walk to the crash site was brief, but felt longer, Albert's uncharacteristic silence casting a pall over the golden evening light. Agatha noted his unease, the way his shoulders hunched forward and his hands fidgeted in his pockets. The scene they arrived at was anything but calm. A loose ring of villagers had formed at the edge of the field, murmuring in low voices. Two constables moved about the wreckage, their dark uniforms stark against the muted greens and browns of the countryside. The plane itself was half buried in a patch of soft earth, its propeller twisted and one wing crumpled at an odd angle. Beside it, Larry Stokes sat on the ground, a hand pressed to his forehead, looking dazed but unharmed. His leather flight jacket was smudged with dirt, and his famous air of swagger was nowhere to be seen. Albert rushed to speak with the authorities, leaving Agatha to linger just outside the crowd. Her sharp eyes took in every detail: the jagged lines of the broken wing, the trampled grass where the villagers had gathered, the scattered belongings that had spilled from the cargo hold. What she didn't see was the metallic briefcase. It should have been there, visible, even in this chaos. But it was conspicuously absent. Standing a few steps back, Agatha let the voices around her tell their stories. "Stokes always flew too low, showing off for the crowd," one farmer muttered to another. "Bound to happen one day." Another woman, clutching a shawl against the evening breeze, shook her head. "But it was so sudden, wasn't it? No engine trouble, no stalling, just down out of nowhere. Makes you wonder." A younger man, someone from the inn by the look of his apron, added, "I saw Milligan walking toward the station after the crash. Didn't even stop to see if anyone was hurt. Shifty, that one." Agatha said nothing, but the comments wove themselves into a pattern in her mind. She observed Larry as he sat, his eyes darting toward the wreckage as if searching for something. He spoke only briefly to the constable, his words clipped and cautious. He wasn't just shaken, Agatha thought, he was afraid. She adjusted her hat, smoothed her gloves, and waited. The villagers' whispers might be gossip, and Milligan's departure could be coincidence. But her instincts, finely tuned through years of close observation, told her that this crash was no ordinary accident. The light was fading when Agatha Marple made her way toward the circle of onlookers surrounding Larry Stokes. For all the drama of the crash, the man himself appeared remarkably intact. A small bandage on his temple, a dust-streaked flight jacket, and a far-away look in his eyes as if he were listening to music no one else could hear. He stood leaning against the side of a constable's automobile, speaking quietly to an officer who was jotting something down in a pocket notebook. Agatha waited her turn, letting the constable move on before stepping closer. She studied Larry's face as she approached, a mask of calm that didn't quite fit. His jaw was set too tightly, his shoulders stiff beneath the easy posture he tried to maintain. "Mr. Stokes," she began lightly, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Miss Marple, Agatha Marple." Larry nodded absently, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice flat, "nice to meet you. I trust you're feeling well, considering the circumstances." "Fine," he said, then glanced past her as though searching for someone else to take over this tiresome exchange. "It could have been worse." "Quite fortunate, then," Agatha said, "though I dare say not very fortunate for the aircraft. Have you any idea what went wrong?" Larry hesitated. "No idea," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the edge of the field. "Engine just stopped, I suppose." Agatha tilted her head. An unusual thing for an experienced pilot not to notice. No warning, no strange noises beforehand? "No, nothing," he said quickly. "It just happened." From behind them, Albert Wingfield stepped forward, clearing his throat with exaggerated vigour. "I'd say you're lucky to be standing here at all, Larry," he said, his jovial tone strained at the edges. "Planes are temperamental things after all." Agatha turned to look at her cousin, noting the faint sheen on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Yes, I'm sure," she said evenly. "Although it's not every day one sees a plane simply drop out of the sky." Albert coughed again, shifting his weight. "Well, I suppose it's best to leave it to the authorities to sort out. No sense in speculating just yet." "And the package?" Agatha asked casually. "Was that retrieved from the wreckage?" Albert's face froze for the briefest of moments before he plastered on a tight smile. "I'm sure that'll turn up. Not worth troubling ourselves over now." Agatha studied him for a moment, then returned her attention to Larry. The pilot had taken a step away, his body turned toward the field as though he longed to vanish into the deepening twilight. He looked over his shoulder once, meeting her gaze for an instant before looking away. His expression was not that of a man bewildered by chance. It was the face of someone who had seen a great deal more than he cared to admit. Interesting, Agatha thought. She said her goodbyes and turned back toward the village. The path home was soft underfoot, and the cool evening air should have been refreshing. Instead, her mind buzzed with fragments of conversation and unanswered questions. The plane's sudden failure, the briefcase's disappearance, Larry's evasive manner, Albert's diversions. None of it made sense. But she was certain it would. The trick, she knew, was in letting the pieces settle before trying to fit them together. She quickened her step, the pale glow of a street lamp just visible ahead, and made her way home. By the following morning, the incident at the airfield had already begun to take on a life of its own. Quiet discussions over breakfast tables were filled with theories, and the small post office saw more than a few letters sent out to distant relatives detailing the drama. Yet it was the absence of any official explanation and the conspicuous silence of certain individuals that left Agatha Marple's curiosity simmering. Determined to make her inquiries under the guise of friendly concern, she paid a visit to Larry Stokes. He was staying at the Railway Arms, a modest inn on the edge of the village, its peeling green shutters lending it a slightly forlorn air. The landlady, Mrs. Carter, greeted Agatha warmly and pointed her to the corner table in the small dining room, where Larry sat nursing a cup of coffee. His expression was guarded, though he managed a faint smile as Agatha approached. "Miss Marple," he said, rising slightly. "I wasn't expecting company so early." "Good morning, Mr. Stokes. I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her tone cheerful but not overly so. She gestured to the chair opposite him. "I thought I'd call in and see how you were feeling. Yesterday's events must have been quite a shock." He hesitated, then nodded, settling back into his seat. "I'm doing fine, all things considered," he said. "Just shaken up." Agatha settled herself primly in the chair and smoothed her skirt. "I'm glad to hear that. Crashes are terribly unpleasant, even when one escapes without a scratch." Larry's mouth tightened ever so slightly. "Yes, well, I suppose I was lucky." "I dare say it wasn't entirely luck," Agatha said lightly, sipping the tea that Mrs. Carter had brought over. "Experience and skill no doubt played a part." Larry gave a half shrug, his eyes dropping to the table. "I've flown through worse." "Still," Agatha continued, setting her cup down, "I imagine you must have known something was amiss before take-off. Did the engine sound peculiar, perhaps, or was there some difficulty during the pre-flight check?" At this, Larry's gaze snapped back to hers, and his tone grew sharper. "The engine was fine," he said. "Everything was fine." "Oh, I see," Agatha said, her expression innocent. "Though I could have sworn I saw you in a rather heated discussion with Mr. Milligan before you departed. Something about the briefcase, wasn't it?" Larry stiffened, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "What's Milligan got to do with anything?" "The crash was mechanical." "Just bad luck." Agatha tilted her head. "So the briefcase didn't concern you?" His jaw tensed. "I already told you. The engine just cut out. I don't know why." For a moment Agatha said nothing, letting the silence linger just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then she smiled faintly and leaned back in her chair. "I see. Well, I shan't bother you further, Mr. Stokes. I'm glad you're feeling better." She rose to her feet, leaving Larry to his now cold coffee. As she made her way out of the inn, she could feel his eyes on her back. There was something in his tone, in the quickness of his responses, that set her mind ticking. The crash might have been mechanical, as he claimed, but his eagerness to deflect questions, especially those related to Milligan, only deepened her suspicion that there was far more to the story than Larry wanted anyone to know. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the inn's dining room, softening the edges of the modest wooden furniture and throwing faint patterns on the pale walls. Larry Stokes sat hunched over a cup of coffee, his once crisp flight jacket still smudged from yesterday's incident. His gaze seemed fixed on some distant point beyond the tabletop. Agatha Marple sat across from him, perfectly composed, her hat neatly pinned, and her gloves folded beside her saucer. To an observer, the scene might appear entirely casual, a middle-aged lady enjoying a quiet chat with a somewhat shaken aviator. Yet, beneath Agatha's pleasant demeanour was a razor-sharp focus, honed through years of quietly observing human nature. She stirred her tea and regarded Larry with a mild expression. Mr. Stokes, I must say you have a rather admirable knack for brushing yourself off after a mishap. Not many would appear so composed after a crash." Larry glanced at her, a flicker of unease in his otherwise stoic features. "I've had my fair share of rough landings. Just another day in the life of a pilot." "Indeed," Agatha said with a small smile, "though not all landings involve quite so much excitement and baggage." His brow furrowed slightly. "I don't follow." Agatha set her spoon down gently, the faint clink of silver on porcelain the only sound in the room. "The metallic case, Mr. Stokes, the one you were handed at the airfield. I noticed it wasn't among the wreckage." Larry's fingers tightened around his coffee cup, the knuckles blanching. "I don't know anything about that," he said quickly. Too quickly. Agatha's gaze lingered on his hands, watching the tremor that passed through them before he set the cup down. "How curious," she murmured. "It seemed to be such a sturdy item. I would have thought it might survive an accident." Larry's jaw tightened, and his eyes darted to the window. "I'm sure I wouldn't know. Maybe it fell out. Not my concern." Agatha nodded lightly, as if accepting his answer. "Quite right. If it's not your concern, I suppose it's not mine either." She leaned back slightly, her gloved hands folding neatly in her lap. "Still, you must admit it's an odd thing to go missing so abruptly." Larry's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Instead, he reached for the sugar bowl and busied himself with stirring his coffee. The silence that followed felt weighted, as though the unspoken thoughts in his head were heavier than he cared to show. Agatha waited a moment longer, then smiled pleasantly. "Thank you for the chat, Mr. Stokes. I'm glad you're recovering." With that, she rose, collected her gloves, and made her way out of the inn's dining room. As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her back, and the faint smile that played on her lips carried a trace of satisfaction. Larry's trembling hand, his quick denial, his refusal to meet her gaze. These were small clues, but together they painted a picture. The metallic case was not just missing, it was being hidden, and Larry Stokes, with his bravado and evasive answers, had something he very much wished to keep from prying eyes. Maple Street basked in the afternoon sunlight, its narrow cobblestones gleaming like an oil painting freshly varnished. At this hour the street was serene, its stately Georgian houses standing shoulder to shoulder like polite neighbours at a town meeting. The only signs of life came from the walled garden at number 17, where the murmur of voices and the occasional chime of silverware drifted into the street. Agatha Marple made her way through the wrought-iron gate, her practical shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. The garden party, though modest, was tastefully arranged. A long table draped in white linen stood at the centre, laden with finger sandwiches, petit fours, and an impressive silver tea service. Lavender and roses bordered the gathering, their heady fragrance mingling with the faint tang of freshly brewed Earl Grey. A handful of guests, mostly well-dressed women in wide-brimmed hats and pastel frocks, stood in clusters, chatting over porcelain cups. It was all terribly picturesque, yet Agatha, ever attuned to the currents beneath the calm surface, noted the tension radiating from Rose Whitlock. The hostess stood apart from her guests, a glass of lemonade in hand, her lips curved into a smile that seemed carved from marble. Rose was always the picture of elegance, her pale pink dress flowing like a waterfall of silk, her dark hair pinned with pearls. But today there was a brittleness to her composure. Even from a distance Agatha could see that her smile never quite reached her eyes. "Miss Marple." Rose's voice, pleasant but strained, floated across the garden as she noticed her guest. "What a surprise! I hadn't expected to see you today." Agatha approached with a gracious nod. "I do hope I'm not intruding. I was passing by and thought I might pay you a visit." "Not at all," Rose said, her smile sharpening, "though I confess I haven't much time to spare. I'm playing hostess, as you see." "Yes, quite the lovely gathering," Agatha said. Her eyes drifted briefly over the guests, taking in the carefully curated group of acquaintances. "I'm impressed that you managed this all on such short notice." Rose's laughter was light, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. Irritation? Amusement? It was difficult to say. "Oh, I've always been fond of entertaining. It's a pleasant distraction." Agatha smiled faintly. Distractions can be quite useful, I imagine, especially after all that excitement yesterday. I trust you've recovered from the ordeal?" Rose's brow twitched ever so slightly. "The ordeal?" she repeated. "The crash," Agatha clarified. "A frightful thing, and so close to the village, too. I thought perhaps you might have been unsettled by it." Rose waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, Larry and his stunts. He always has a knack for dramatics." "Indeed," Agatha said, tilting her head as if pondering the remark. "Still, it must have been rather alarming, considering your history, I mean." At this, Rose's smile faltered, the edges pulling tight. "Our history?" she asked coolly. "You and Mr. Stokes," Agatha said lightly. "After all, there was a time—" "That time is long past," Rose cut in, her voice firm. "I have no interest in Larry Stokes, none whatsoever." Her tone left little room for argument, but Agatha detected something underneath. Presentment, perhaps, or even pain. "Well," Agatha said after a brief pause, "I imagine you must be relieved to have moved on." "Yes," Rose said shortly, turning her attention to a nearby guest who was approaching with a question about the tea. Agatha stepped back, allowing the conversation to flow around her. She watched as Rose fielded questions and offered polite smiles, all the while noting the stiffness in her movements, the clipped responses that betrayed her composure. It was one of Rose's guests, a younger woman in a lemon-yellow dress, who provided the final detail of interest. As Agatha reached for a cucumber sandwich from the buffet, she overheard the woman laughing softly to a companion. "Did you hear what happened at the inn the other night?" the woman said in a low voice. "Rose and that pilot, what's his name, had quite the row. Everyone in the lounge heard it." Her companion raised a brow. "Larry Stokes?" "Yes, something about money, I think. It was quite the scene." Agatha didn't react outwardly, but the comment settled neatly in her mind. She tucked it away, a puzzle piece waiting for its proper place. For now, she remained as she always did, unassuming, watchful, and quietly patient. The truth, she knew, would reveal itself in time. The early morning light cast long shadows across the crash site, giving the scene a hushed, almost reverent quality. The charred remains of the biplane lay scattered across a patch of soft earth at the edge of the field. Though the wreckage had drawn a fair share of gawkers the day before, it now sat undisturbed, save for a lone constable who stood watch nearby. Agatha Marple, armed with little more than her sensible handbag and keen sense of observation, approached the site with the constable's permission. As she picked her way through the debris, her footsteps careful on the uneven ground, Agatha's eyes moved with a deliberate sweep. The engine was twisted and blackened, one wing crumpled like paper, and the cockpit a ruin of shattered glass and bent controls. Yet her attention was drawn not to the obvious destruction, but to the subtler details that a cargo hold. The faint impression of something heavy having been dragged through the dirt. She crouched and ran a gloved hand lightly over the disturbed ground. The marks were faint, but they led away from the wreckage, disappearing into the tree line at the edge of the field. Straightening up, she smoothed her skirt and glanced toward the constable. He was looking in the opposite direction, engrossed in a cigarette. Satisfied that she would not be interrupted, Agatha followed the trail. It was not long before she spotted something out of place among the underbrush. There, caught in the roots of a gnarled oak, was a single leather glove. Agatha bent to pick it up, her brow furrowing as she turned it over. The material was worn but still supple, and a faint trace of oil stained the palm. She had seen this glove before, just the day prior. It had been on Milligan's hand when he handed over the metallic case. The glove's sudden appearance here, some distance from the crash, was telling. Someone had come for the case before the authorities arrived, and though the case itself was still missing, the gloves served as a breadcrumb leading further into the woods. Agatha let her gaze linger on the glove for a moment longer, then carefully tucked it into her handbag. Straightening her hat, she allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The wreckage might have yielded no straightforward answers, but this single clue, the hint of a hasty retreat and a misplaced glove, was enough to turn suspicion into certainty. Someone had taken deliberate action to ensure the case was removed, and that someone had left behind a trail they did not think to cover. Agatha turned and made her way back toward the field, her mind already racing ahead. Agatha Marple's reputation for unearthing truths, however buried, often began with a simple conversation at the village shop. It was a place of chatter, after all, a modest storefront with a wooden counter, worn smooth by decades of elbows leaning in to hear the latest. And it was there, on a morning when the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the acrid tang of paraffin, that she first heard about Milligan's peculiar habits. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Sedgwick, was an unassuming woman with a quick hand for weighing sugar and an even quicker tongue for dispensing gossip. She spoke almost off-handedly, leaning over the counter as she passed Agatha a neat parcel of tea leaves. "That Milligan fellow, odd sort, wasn't he? Always slipping in here with those big envelopes, whispering with Mr. Winfield as if they had secrets worth keeping." Agatha's expression remained pleasant, though her mind hummed with interest. "Envelopes, you say?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Sedgwick said, adjusting her apron. "Came by quite regularly before that crash. Then, just like that, vanished. Didn't even stop by for his usual packet of tobacco." "Curious," Agatha murmured, tucking her parcel into her bag. "Most curious." Later that day, Agatha called on her cousin Albert Wingfield, finding him, as expected, in his small office at the airfield. The room was cluttered with papers, maps pinned to the walls, and a large oak desk whose surface bore the marks of a man accustomed to pounding out decisions. Albert greeted her warmly enough, but his demeanour changed when Agatha mentioned Milligan's name. "Milligan? Oh, I'm not sure what you mean," he said too quickly, his hands fussing with a sheaf of documents. "Surely you remember him," Agatha said lightly. "A stout fellow, always carrying envelopes. Mrs. Sedgwick tells me he visited quite often." Albert hesitated. "I suppose, yes, he did drop by on occasion. Nothing unusual, though." "Oh, I think it might have been a little unusual," Agatha said, her tone pleasant. "What was he delivering?" Albert chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Just a few odds and ends, papers for the airfield. You know how these things are." "Indeed," Agatha replied. "But it seems odd that he'd leave so suddenly after the crash." At this, Albert's face reddened. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Agatha. Milligan wasn't involved in anything untoward." "No?" Agatha tilted her head, watching his reaction carefully. "He was a courier, though, wasn't he?" Albert fumbled with his papers, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. "If you must know, he brought sensitive materials, things that had to be handled discreetly. I agreed to store them temporarily, that's all." "Quite a responsibility," Agatha said, letting the words hang in the air. She watched as Albert avoided her gaze, busying himself with a pile of invoices that seemed far less pressing than the conversation. After Albert excused himself, mumbling something about checking on a fuel delivery, Agatha let her curiosity guide her to the desk. There was nothing improper about a bit of observation, after all. She wasn't one to pry for prying's sake, yet she couldn't help but notice a small drawer on the right-hand side secured with a brass lock. The keyhole glinted in the lamplight, and though she made no move to open it, its presence seemed significant. Why lock away papers in a desk that was otherwise cluttered and accessible? When Albert returned, his eyes darted to the desk as if he'd left something incriminating in plain sight. He quickly stepped in front of it, resting one hand on the surface. "Agatha, it's best if we leave this business to the proper authorities." "Oh, of course," Agatha said with a faint smile. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering." Yet as she left the office and stepped back into the crisp afternoon air, her suspicions had deepened. Albert's evasive answers, his flustered behaviour, and that locked drawer, all of it pointed to something he desperately wanted to hide. And if there was one thing Agatha Marple knew, it was that people rarely went to such lengths over nothing at all. Maple Street lay still beneath the fading afternoon sun, its quiet rows of Georgian townhouses seemingly untouched by the troubles that stirred behind closed doors. Number 17, where Rose Whitlock resided, stood out only slightly. its curtains drawn just a bit tighter, its front steps swept just a bit more carefully. As Agatha Marple walked briskly down the cobbled road, her thoughts fell into orderly lines, her approach shifting from the gentle probing of her previous visit to something more direct. When Rose answered the door, her expression faltered, just for a moment before she stepped back to let Agatha in. This time there was no garden party to mask her mood. The drawing-room, though impeccably arranged, felt heavy with unspoken tension. Rose gestured to a chair and poured tea without speaking, her movements mechanical. When she finally sat opposite Agatha, she folded her hands neatly in her lap and fixed her visitor with a practised smile. "Miss Marple," Rose said, her tone polite but guarded. "Back so soon? I do hope everything is all right." Agatha tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I wanted to clarify a few things, Mrs. Whitlock. The crash at the airfield, the missing package, and your disagreement with Mr. Stokes the night before?" The teacup in Rose's hand trembled just for a moment. "What disagreement?" "The one that occurred at the inn," Agatha said evenly. "Several people heard raised voices. Yours and Larry's?" Rose hesitated, her carefully constructed composure starting to fray. She set the teacup down, the porcelain clinking against the saucer. "Yes," she admitted after a pause. "Larry came to see me. He wanted money." "Money?" Agatha's voice was calm, almost conversational. Rose's jaw tightened. "He threatened to reveal certain unsavoury details about my late husband's business dealings. I'm sure you've heard the rumours. Henry wasn't always the most scrupulous man. Larry wanted to use that against me." "And you paid him," Agatha said. It wasn't a question. "Of course I did," Rose replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I didn't want my husband's memory dragged through the mud. Whatever Henry did, he's gone now. I didn't see the point exposing it all for the sake of Larry's greed." "And you had no reason to harm Mr. Stokes?" Agatha asked, watching Rose carefully. Rose leaned back, a faint flush colouring her cheeks. "Absolutely not. I gave him what he wanted and sent him on his way. I thought that would be the end of it." For a long moment Agatha said nothing. Her eyes drifted to the side table where a small brass clock ticked steadily. Then she glanced back at Rose. "You mentioned giving him what he wanted," Agatha said. "But what about the package he was carrying that night, the one Milligan brought to the airfield? Do you know what became of it?" Rose's expression froze, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight. "Really?" Agatha replied, her tone light. "It's curious, then, that a package so obviously important would simply vanish after Larry's crash, particularly when you've been so careful to protect your husband's legacy." Rose's eyes darted toward the window, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a brief moment she looked as if she might argue, but then she simply shook her head. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Miss Marple," she said softly. "I've already told you. I paid him off, I didn't harm him, and I know nothing about a package." Agatha gave a faint, non-committal smile and reached for her gloves. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitlock. You've been most helpful." As she rose to leave, Rose remained seated, her knuckles white against the chair. Agatha walked slowly to the door, her mind ticking over each hesitation, each faltering note in Rose's carefully composed denials. By the time she reached the street, the late afternoon sun had slipped lower, casting Maple Street in a warm, golden light. Yet the shadows at the edges of her thoughts deepened. Rose Whitlock knew more than she let on, and Agatha was determined to find out exactly what. The heavy oak door of Albert Wingfield's study clicked shut, muffling the lively bustle of the household beyond. The room was snug, the air faintly scented with pipe smoke and the leather of well-worn armchairs. A fire crackled in the grate, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. Seated around the room were 3 figures, each wearing a mask of polite curiosity, but with tension coiled beneath their measured expression. Agatha Marple sat poised at one end of the room, her posture as impeccable as her composure. In her gloved hands was a small notebook, its pages filled with her precise handwriting. She glanced over the gathered group. Larry Stokes, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, Rose Whitlock, her usual elegance marred by a faint shadow of apprehension, and Albert himself, His jovial demeanour stretched thin. "Thank you all for coming," Agatha began, her voice calm yet firm. "I thought it best we have a frank discussion, given the peculiar circumstances surrounding the crash." Albert chuckled uneasily, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "A frank discussion, is it? Well, let's hope it's not too grim." Agatha smiled faintly. "I do hope not, Albert." With that she began to recount what she had observed, her tone steady and deliberate. She spoke of Milligan's suspicious deliveries, the heavy metallic case that vanished after the crash, and the peculiar drag marks leading into the woods. She reminded them of Larry's evasive answers, the missing glove that tied back to Milligan, and Rose's reluctance to address her argument with Larry the night before the incident. Taken individually, these details seem minor. Coincidences, perhaps, Agatha said. But together they tell a different story. The room was silent except for the crackling fire. Larry shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor. Rose's hand tightened on the arm of her seat, and Albert's fingers stilled, his expression unreadable. "I'll come to the heart of it," Agatha continued. "The crash was no accident. It was staged." Albert's eyes narrowed. "Staged? Agatha, surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly that, Albert," she said evenly. "And the one who orchestrated it was you." Larry's head snapped up, and Rose let out a faint gasp. Albert's ruddy complexion darkened as he started to protest, but Albert pressed on. "You had Milligan deliver documents to the airfield, sensitive papers that connected you to a covert operation. I don't know all the details, but it's clear these documents, if made public, would have damaged more than just your reputation, so you ensured they were destroyed before they could reach their intended destination. The simplest way to do that was to arrange a crash, one that appeared accidental but guaranteed the destruction of the evidence." "That's absurd," Albert blustered, though the sweat beading on his brow suggested otherwise. "Why would I do such a thing? It's preposterous." "You might have managed it more quietly if not for the people around you," Agatha said, her gaze shifting to Rose. Mrs. Whitlock here may not have sabotaged the plane, but she had her own reasons for wanting Larry discredited. She agreed to keep him distracted, ensuring he flew at that specific time. Her argument with him the night before was no coincidence. She needed him angry, flustered, and less likely to question anything unusual before takeoff. Rose stiffened, her mouth opening to protest, but no words came. "Larry!" His face pale, looked from Rose to Albert, then to Agatha. "You were both counting on Larry's reputation for recklessness to make it look like a simple accident," Agatha said, her voice sharp now. "But the truth has a way of showing itself no matter how cleverly it's hidden. The silence that followed was deafening. The crackling fire seemed louder than before, filling the heavy pause. Agatha folded her notebook and placed it on her lap. "You see," she concluded, her voice soft but unyielding, "the thing about lies is that they leave traces. You can burn the evidence, but you cannot erase the footsteps leading to the fire." Larry sat motionless, his face a study in confusion and disbelief. Rose looked away, her hands trembling in her lap. Albert slumped back in his chair, his bluster gone, his eyes fixed on the floor. Agatha rose, smoothing her gloves and adjusting her hat. "I trust we'll have no more accidents," she said, her tone cool and steady. "Good evening." She left the study and stepped into the cool night air, the door clicking shut behind her. On Maple Street the lamps were just beginning to glow, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Agatha paused for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, before heading off toward home. The mystery had been solved, but she knew there would be more secrets to uncover, more lies to untangle, and more truths that would inevitably come to light. The great oak door swung shut behind Agatha Marple as she stepped out into the crisp night air. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining Maple Street, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The street's customary stillness had returned, though now it carried an air of quiet unease. The drama inside Albert Wingfield's study was over, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. At the far end of the street, Larry Stokes stood by the gate to the railway arms. A small bag rested at his feet, and his posture, normally so confident, was slumped. He glanced toward Agatha as she approached. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. "I don't reckon I'll be staying here much longer." "I'd gathered as much," Agatha replied, her tone neutral. "What will you do now?" He shrugged. "Start over somewhere new, I suppose. Somewhere no one knows me. Seems best for everyone." Agatha nodded. She suspected he'd been expecting condemnation, but she offered none. Larry wasn't a bad man, not truly, just one caught in the tangle of other people's schemes. Still, she knew his departure would be a relief for some, a disappointment for others. Maple Street had a way of clinging to its secrets, and Larry, by leaving, was freeing himself from the burdens he might otherwise carry. Farther up the road, the curtains of number 17 were drawn tight. Rose Whitlock, once a radiant fixture of the village, had withdrawn behind her immaculate facade. Agatha imagined her sitting alone in her drawing-room, nursing a glass of sherry and watching the flicker of firelight. Rose's involvement in Albert's plan had been more circumstantial than malicious, yet the stain of her choices would remain. Agatha doubted she would host another garden party any time soon. Scandal had a way of draining the sparkle from even the brightest socialite. When Agatha reached the airfield, Albert was waiting. He stood near the gate, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. There was a heavy, almost desperate quality to his presence, as if he were clinging to the last threads of his old life. "Agatha," he began, his voice pleading, "you must understand. I never meant for things to get so out of hand. I only wanted to protect the airfield. The village needed it. The jobs, the visitors. I thought I was helping." Agatha regarded him carefully. "Helping?" she repeated. "By staging an accident? By destroying documents you feared would come to light? I didn't think it through." Albert admitted, his face pale under the moonlight. "I acted out of fear. But it was for the greater good. I swear it." "The greater good," Agatha said softly, her tone unreadable. She considered him for a long moment. "That may be so, Albert, but it's not my place to make that judgment. There are authorities better suited to weigh your intentions against your actions." Albert's expression fell. "You've gone to the police, then?" "I have," Agatha said simply. "The truth needs to come out, for the village's sake as much as anyone's." Albert dropped his gaze, his shoulders slumping. "I suppose that's fair," he said quietly, though his tone was tinged with regret. As she left him, Agatha felt no triumph, only a solemn sense of resolution. She understood Albert's motivations. She might even have sympathized with his fear of exposure. But sympathy wasn't justice, and justice, as she well knew, was rarely as simple as it appeared. By the time she reached her own door, the air was sharp and cold, the kind that invited reflection. She paused on her front step, glancing back toward the dimly lit street. Maple Street had always seemed such a picture of tranquility. Pristine homes, genteel residents, not a hair out of place. But the events of the past few days had revealed something darker beneath that polished surface. Greed, desperation, pride, these were not the vices of strangers. They were here among friends and neighbours. They lingered in the shadows of every carefully drawn curtain, every hurried glance. Agatha unlocked her door and stepped inside. The warmth of her sitting room welcomed her, yet her mind was still caught on the evening's revelations. As she settled into her armchair, a cup of tea in hand, she allowed herself a brief smile. Human nature, she thought, was endlessly fascinating, so tangled, so contradictory. Justice, discretion, understanding, none of it was clear-cut, but perhaps that was what made life interesting. The constant effort to see through the web, to untangle the threads, and glimpse something resembling truth. And then, as the clock struck 10 and the house settled into quiet, Agatha Marple turned her attention to her knitting, content in the knowledge that this particular mystery at least had been solved.